nas yetya, I nas Hualwan Kawanas I Lamnala. We respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, where we live, learn, and play. Moving to adoption, have received regrets from the BEBC chair. Trustee Hutchins is unavoidably caught in a business issue. So, moving to adoption of the agenda. Moved by Trustee Thorne, seconded by Trustee DeGroot. All those in favor? Motion carries. Moving to item 3, business and operations. Mr. Segwest.
Thank you. There are 3 budget-related items on tonight's agenda. We're going to start with the March financial projection. I know we've just done the February one, but we also had time to get the March one prepared based on the balances in our accounts at March, at March 31st. So it hasn't shifted that much from the last time we were here. We're still waiting in the revenue section to find out about our share of the employer health tax reimbursement from government. So there's going to be a grant coming. Based on the size of the grant and the percentage of our district, we expect that it will be around $350,000. So our revenues will likely be closer to $570,000 greater than expected. What you see up there right now is that we're exceeding revenue in our interest account, which is something I'm going to be bringing up again later on in the next, in the third item. And we seem to be exceeding revenue right now in our miscellaneous revenues, so we're doing well there, and that would be registration fees typically for the international program. Down in the expenditures, we have looked out to the end of the year and are pretty close to budget on our principals, about $37,000 out. Our teachers are $117,000, and these are to the good. Education assistants, $173,000. When we did have a couple of positions that were intended, and I'll come back to this again in the third presentation, that were intended for community outreach that were never realized in this year. So I finally brought them into circles because it doesn't look like at this point they'll be in place by the end of the year. So that's why that number has shifted up. And then you can see through there that USW are within $121,000, excluded just about $5,000. And we're going to be over by about $150,000 in our casual replacements this year based on projection. And I think that figure would have been closer to 250 had we not had the snow event, which not only did it have days where we weren't bringing in replacements, but it also changed people's physical well-being, having had 4 days off during February. So the absenteeism after that went way down. That's fair. Moving into the benefits, our statutory benefits are just slightly over budget by $28,000. We're doing really well on our pension account and our health account. The health benefits was a benefit premium holiday for 2 months. We pay in our premiums during the year, and sometimes we've overpaid based on the estimate that the Pacific Blue Cross or our dental programs have estimated for the district for premium. So we didn't have to pay for January and February for our teachers, and that resulted in some surplus. I'm thinking that we're going to be over in our professional development and travel, so I put that over at about $50,000. We're under on insurance at $45,000. Recognize Randy. So overall in services, and I used to have a surplus in utilities. So the last time you saw this, I thought we were going to be underspending utilities. But looking at those February bills, it's not good. Like, that was a really cold month. That was I believe it was one of our coldest Februaries on record here. And so I've taken that out because right now it's looking very close to budget. So as we scroll down a little bit more, right now I have the projection. I think the last time here it was just over $1 million, and this is off a budget. Now I'm up to 117, and that does not include what I'm expecting, that's $350,000 still on the employer health tax. So I think we're going to be in the 1.4 range at the end of the year based on what we know today. And that's important because I'll be bringing that up again later, which is why I have it earlier here in the agenda. Is there any questions on the projection? And if not, I can move on to the survey.
Any questions, trustees? On to the survey.
Okay. So our communications specialist manager. Thank you. Yes, there it is. Communications manager. Mike Russell put together this briefing note based on our survey results. 575 people responded to the survey. That is up by, I believe, about 65% over the previous year, which was up, I think, about 70% over the year before that. So we can see that we're getting much more feedback on our surveys. When I looked at the results, I saw some really thoughtful responses from people that had written in. Not everybody just answered the easy ones, which were yes or no, but there were people who actually put thought into their responses. And Mike's taken some time to pull out some of the big themes from that. It's a fair read to read through 575 individual responses, and we can't really bring that to this committee. So the first question was to describe your involvement with the school district, and you can see the results there. That we had parents or guardians with 387 answering that way. So that meant that, I think in other years we've seen a higher number of staff to parents because it was able to get out in staff newsletters and they answered. This time this is a higher number of parents and guardians answering. We asked a question around early years and 417 of the 575 agreed or strongly agreed that that was a good idea and a valuable use of district funds to invest in early years strategies. We asked about what those types of programs should be, and this is where the big themes were starting to develop. There was increasing education assistance or early childhood educator time, developing of before and after school care for children. We had continued funding and expansion of the Strong Start program, so those are popular and include aspects of social emotional learning for early years. We asked about investing in student wellness. Again, strong support for student wellness, 451 of 575 respondents. 150 people asked answered when we asked, well, what do you think about what they should be considering? So more time allotted for counselors in schools, wellness programs, mental health programming through all grade levels, major themes that came out of that. And we asked about programs of choice. We know how popular, and we have our principal of our nature-based program here, just as a center here, but we know how popular that program was this year after it was introduced. Certainly the kindergarten enrollments exceeded the spaces that were available, and we had to have a lottery. So we asked about those types of programs again for the future, and skills and trades has come up as our number one, and part of that might be that we need to tell more about what we're doing in skills and trades, because we actually have a fair amount of skills and trades in our secondary. They may not be aware of that. But you can see there that nature-based learning is still very, very popular, as is technology and fine arts as other options. And French immersion appears, which we know has been successful in our district again. So interesting to see the way those landed. That's pretty similar to last year as well. And then, is there anything else that the board need to know? And so this is where Mike's pulled out the most common word is support. Typically asking for more supports in class, as well as additional supports for students with special needs. So that's more the parent response. So that's a high-level summary. Our trustees all have the raw data, and you can go through that. I guess as you have time, but certainly I think 575 people is the most engagement that I think we've ever had on the budget. That's the most responses. We're just improving so much on our surveys and the feedback. And now that if we actually give Mike a year's notice or a few months' notice and say, well, we need to do this week, I think of what we can accomplish.
Well, before you go on, I think we should thank Mike for all of that work. That's not an easy thing to go through 500 and some surveys in a day and a half, probably, and then summarize it. So, thank you.
Good job.
Appreciate it.
So this information is available now to help guide the board. What I have is a presentation for the third item. That won't be as quick as those other two, so apologies if people timeline. But I have a number of slides here now to go over on our budget, which will be looking at our new opening position, as well as some of the things that the board really don't have discretion over, and some of the things that the board do have discretion over. So I think we'll toggle over to me here. I'm on one, yes. So this is our first public delivery of some of the budget options that we've been considering, some of the information around the grants, some strategies for beginning to balance the budget, and we'll just start off with an enrollment slide. So it's always interesting to look at where we've been and where we're headed. So we do see that we were in a period of decline of between 200 and 300 students for many years, for over a decade. And that's really declining at the rate of approximately an elementary school a year, if you're thinking of 200 to 300 students. And so we would have retirements in that period of time and not really have recruitment challenges, because we would basically be going down by about the same rate as people would be leaving our system. And then we bottomed out, and now we had the introduction of the Classroom Enhancement Fund, and we have growth again. So now we have those recruitment, not challenges, but we certainly are in the business again of growing and hiring, and we're all optimistic about the growth of the district. So this is pretty close to what was predicted for our district when we go back to those early demographic reports that Bob Yates had produced, that we would bottom out around the time that we did, but we grew faster than we thought. So this is what's new, is that we're growing quite rapidly. Some of those years in our growth charts, this past year, I think, is 270 students over last year. So that's just there for a reference. I'm putting the context here. Now we're looking at where our money comes from. So right now, this district is funded almost 90% off the provincial grant, and 6.86% from local education agreements. So those are contracts with the local First Nations for the delivery of education services. And that means that they're funded in a slightly different way. The money comes from the federal government through to the local First Nations, and then they forward those funds to the school district. So if you combine the orange and the blue piece of the pie, the district doesn't have a lot of discretionary revenue or the ability to fund themselves in other ways. The green piece of the pie is the International Student Program. That's really where our additional revenues come from. We have a little bit of interest revenue and a little bit of lease revenue, but we're pretty reliant on the funding formula for the majority of our funding. And where do we spend it? With the bulk of it, the blue pie is on instruction, district administration at 3.44, operations and maintenance 11.63, transportation 2.96. This, if we make the payment in this budget of $67,014, will be the final year of paying down the reduction of the unfunded employee benefits, which we started in 2002. So we are one of two districts remaining in the province with that balance, and we're almost done. So I think that's something to celebrate in this budget. We put it in for full payment. What's interesting when we look at data from the districts south of us and two similar sized districts north of us, Comox and Campbell River, is that we are able in this district to spend more per student on instruction than those other 5 districts per head. So our funding per FTE that we invest in instruction is higher than those other 5 districts, which is positive. That's a good message that our money is going to the delivery of services for kids. So I'll have some more data on that, but Sanich did a nice summary of all of our financials. And of course, we spend it on wages and benefits predominantly, and that number has been increasing over time. We probably remember back when that was 88% was wages and benefits and 12% was supplies. And it's been shifting every year as we invest more heavily in people and less in the other areas, or just that people cost more. So that number is still significant and something for the board always to be thinking about. Services, big thing we have in services is our dual credit program. We pay tuition out to VIU for some of those dual credit students, and that's the largest item in there. Utilities and supplies are other pieces of that. And then the 0.08% for the reduction of the unfunded employee future benefits. So to get started, I restated the opening position to just what were the rollover revenues and what were the rollover expenditures. So that's a shortfall of $648,144. I've mentioned that I think we're going to have a surplus of around 1.4. We just went over that. So I'm suggesting that we could appropriate 1.3 million of that surplus because we'll still have just over $1 million remaining in contingency with a $1.3 million surplus, assuming it all happens as projected. And that $1 million in contingency is about 1.25% of budget, and the board's contingency policy is to maintain a balance between 1 and 3% of the budget for unknowns. So instead of building any contingencies into the actual budget, we rely on those surplus funds for anything that goes sideways during the year. I mentioned that we were in the forecast that we were receiving higher interest revenue than we had in the budget. So I think we can start to recognize that. It's happened for a couple of years. We have about $9 million sitting with the Ministry of Finance. So the government has borrowed money back from the school district that they have funded us to offset their own debt, and that is paying a higher interest rate than in the bank. So that leaves us, after I add in those additions, a starting position of positive of about $702,000. But there's a number of things that the board don't have really a lot of discretion or decision over, or their operational requirements that we need to now think about. And the first one is I'm suggesting that we need an absenteeism coverage line increased by $250,000. So I've shown you in the projection that we're going over this year by 150 is what we think we're going to be over for all groups combined. We had that snow event, so without that snow event, I think we would have been over by about 250,000. So if we don't up our absenteeism coverage budget, we will be short. I anticipate we would be short in that area next year. So it's a matter of our change in practice of being able to try to replace people on their first day of absenteeism. We always did, but we didn't have enough education assistants in the past to do that successfully. So now we need to pay for that improvement. The second item is around elementary instruction minutes. The collective agreement for this coming September states that an elementary teacher will have contact time of 1,380 minutes. For this year they have 1,390 minutes. So that means that there's another 1.75 FTE teacher required to basically pay the music time or the non-contact time for those teachers. So that's in contract, so we have to recognize that. Portable moves. After the North Zone conversation, the grade 7s were moved from Crofton and Chemainus Elementary Schools to the Chemainus Secondary School, or will be moved for the fall. So we had a grade reconfiguration. The two portables at Chemainus Elementary that are now free are required in the south zone of the district. So we've identified a school that's going to require 2 additional divisions, and we need to move those buildings. That would be a $400,000 line if we had those grade 7s still at those 2 schools. So we've been able to offset the purchase of 2 portables through that reconfiguration, and now have an $80,000 line. We have Aboriginal education target dollars, so it's the only area of our funding that must be spent as it's delivered. So we have to spend, I think, about $2.25 million on enhanced services for students who have identified as Aboriginal Indigenous and have elected for a program of enhanced study. So that the per pupil rate, so what we receive per student, went up this year significantly. I mean, it really came out of the core base rate, but it went up this year. We've shown you that at the previous meeting, which means our target goes up. So we have to spend another $301,000 in the area of Aboriginal education. That's not a discretion. Our wellness program is underway. This year it was operating out of a provincial grant, which provided us with funding for startup and for the operation of the program. That grant ends at the end of this year. So it was 4 years ago. It was an objective of governments after a major audit of school districts that they entertain the idea of wellness programs as really, really large employers. So that is to provide the resources for our wellness coordinator to continue the work. The maintenance vehicle replacement. So we know that next year we have to take 2 of our vans off the road, and we buy 1 or 2 year old vehicles that have lots of life left in them, so we can get 2 vehicles. And it's also for a mower. So we have a mower that also needs to be addressed. And our bus fleet, we received 1 new school bus for next year, and we would typically receive 2 or 3. The rules around when a school bus will be replaced have changed, so we need to drive our buses for longer. And as we know with a personal vehicle, the longer you own it, once it hits the end of its useful life, it can cost a fair bit. It requires more maintenance than they do when they're new. And over the last year, we have exceeded our bus maintenance budget, so we will be over budget in bus maintenance this year because we had 2 significant events with 2 turbos that blew, and I think they were about $25,000 a piece. So we're concerned that if we don't up our bus fleet maintenance budget, we will not be able to keep those buses running next year. We want to do that. And there's been a secondary transition plan, so this amount may still be could be still to be determined. We're still analyzing the costs of all of that transition work from the elementary students that are moving into the secondary school early, but the board had made a commitment to assisting in some of those activities at year end and at the start of the year, and play spaces for those 7. So we have just parked a bit of money here for that. So after all of that, we would end up being about $275,000, not to the positive, which we were at the start of this. So looking at that's really the starting point before the board look at things that are more optional in nature. If you think about the operating budget as $85 million, and again we always talk about try to put it into a household context. If you have an $85 million budget, you take off the last 3 zeros, and now we're talking about $85,000. We take the last 3 zeros off that $276,000. We're looking for $276 on a kind of on an $85,000 household budget. It's still a lot of money in our context, but on the percentage basis, it's not insurmountable. It certainly means some change, but that change, I think, it was put to me when we presented at DSAC by one of the staff members that was there. It's just like my family not ordering pizza for next year. Cutting out Friday pizza night. So it is still a lot. I'm not diminishing that it's a lot of money, but on a percentage, it is achievable. So why is there a shortfall? Why are we starting this year off with a shortfall? There's a couple of reasons. One is that we balanced last year's budget using almost $2.4 million in surplus. That's not what we're bringing in this year. So we have a structural, what we would call structural deficit. We've been operating at a level using money that we had in the bank. And when that money runs out, you can't afford to run at the same level. There's a change in the per pupil funding rate, which resulted in a larger portion of that grant being targeted. So we wouldn't have had that $300,000 AvEd target difference. We would have been closer in our budget before. So that's gone up. We're not getting as much money as we would have thought after the initial government announcement for the 1.95% payroll tax reimbursement. So it was thought that boards are not going to have to pay that. Now it's boards are not going to have to pay all of that. And we have a slight reduction in our expected international program revenues. There is a bit of a dispute between Canada and the government of China right now, which is affecting some of those business relationships and visa applications. So that's going to have an impact on the program. We're actually doing pretty well. You know, we were signing off a bunch of the applications today, but it does have an impact as that relationship is not as strong as it once was. So other items that we've been thinking about that are other options that the board can be considering is there are still some exempt staff to move through their compensation bands. So we know that we're going in bargaining for the next year, but we expect that for the next 3 years of the collective agreements that there will be increases for the non-unionized staff. And there's still some room for the exempt staff to move. We are expecting that the Public Sector Employers Council will give the board some compensation authority, or will give some board some policy direction that will allow boards to provide principals, vice principals, exam staff with the increases that support staff had last year. So that may come in as well. I think we may have had some information on that now that we can bring to the board. There's been some discussion around the need for our elementary school principals that are not full-time to be full-time. There's currently 3 of those, which requires another 0.8 FTE. It's difficult in a school without a full-time principal when there's an emergency and they're teaching to be able to address those incidents. So that's come up in our discussions. Teachers for enrollment growth, so we are up by about 74 students in our projection for next year, and you would normally put in at a class size of around 1 to 24, 3 teachers. We're not sure. We're working around that number right now. We might be able to fit the framework in without that, so that may be one that we can manage without having to add. So we were working on that today without saying too much, but we're not that far off from meeting that target without that. Normally as well, where you would have growth in your number of students with designations, which we have projected, we would normally be adding education assistants. Again, but it's a discretionary item. So that is to calculate, I think, about 5.5 positions, I think, or 5.7 positions. We're still waiting for some information around the technology plan. It's at the end of its current cycle, and they're in the process of developing the new plan. We don't know what cost implications there will be. Certainly technology came up with the students quite a bit over the DSAC meeting, and as well in other venues. It certainly has come up with some other staff in their conversations with the board as well. So it's one that we're watching and sort of waiting to hear about. Early years supports is another one that we don't have a dollar amount. I did mention in the projection that we had $60,000 that wasn't spent, that we had parked in the EA category, and that amount has rolled over to next year. So there still is $60,000 worth of staffing time that we have carried over to the new budget. So that is embedded, but this would be anything beyond that. Succession planning. This is for our operations department. We are anticipating a number of retirements, all happening very close together. So we know that we need to be planning for that, and we have begun those conversations of what that might look like, and when that will occur. So that one might not actually be an option. That might be one that we really need to be considering moving to the other category. And then trades from capital to the operating budget. So we've been balancing our crew, our work crew, tradespeople, between being paid from operating, which is really smaller school maintenance items, and capital, big things like the Middle Bay renovation. And how long can we keep them on capital? When we have capital work, it's great, but when we don't, then we're going to have to move those people back into the operating budget to do more maintenance work. So we're kind of balancing that out, and that's another one that we like to keep on the radar each year. So if we did all of that, now we have more of a problem. Now we're at $1.3 million behind. So how will the board begin to figure this out? They have survey results, partner groups. There's going to be a public meeting coming up. They have strategic priorities from the past board. There are budget guiding principles which are new. All that will help guide the board in their decision making. The survey closed. We've already talked about it a bit in the briefing note. 575 responses, pretty awesome. The board is forecasting a surplus at the end of the year. I've already brought that in, but that's a big piece of this. If we didn't have any surplus, we'd be looking for significantly more dollars. So we have to start thinking about how we'll live once we don't have surplus. And surplus isn't always planned for. It can just happen because of the luck of a grant or money from the ministry that wasn't expected, or more enrollment than you thought. There are also areas of the budget where additional resources could be directed that would focus on the strategic priorities. So we kind of looked at some of those as well. Early years is one that comes to mind as a strategic priority. To the Classroom Enhancement Fund, It was restored, the collective agreement language for teachers was restored by Supreme Court of Canada in 2016. Right now, our two announcements are exactly the same as this year. So what they've said is that we anticipate, last year they were cautious in their initial announcement. I don't know if the board remember, but we only received about 80% in the first announcement and nothing for overhead in the first announcement. You might recall we were quite concerned. How can they announce so much less than the year before? We know we're going to need it. So what they've done this year is announced what we received in the 18-19 year for both the teacher component and the overhead. And the overhead pays for sick leave replacement for those teachers that are in that fund, professional development funds, and we have about 10 FTE of education assistants supported through the overhead fund. So that's because we have more classrooms, we need to spread our people out more. And that was an argument we made to have our fund increased from about $400,000 to that $988,000. So 2 years ago. So not part of the operating budget. We'll be budgeting for that in special purpose fund. And what about classroom spaces? And I think this is still a relevant slide. This is why I brought this back here. So the first year of the introduction of the Classroom Enhancement Fund, government paid for all the capital improvements that you needed to accommodate all those new divisions. But that was for 17-18 only. In 18-19, they said, well, you're on your own. So you need to be thinking about reinstating classrooms that were currently leased to third parties, such as daycare operators. So in other words, they said you need to use those as a classroom first. Changing catchment areas. Adjusting grade configurations and programming. The board's just gone through that exercise in the North Zone. Reopening closed facilities. That's what we did this year. We reopened Mill Bay. So we've been operating within those government recommendations here in this district. So what we've just done, and I made a note here, is that we have gone through the North Zone conversations, and at the end of that, decided to do number 3, adjust grade configuration in the North Zone. And that has resulted in saving $400,000 in portable acquisition costs for this next year, or at least estimated $400,000. We might have a surprise portable somewhere that we still have to buy, but current numbers tell us that we need 2 portables, and we have 2 portables. That's good news for budgeting. Other special purpose funds, we're going to get the Learning Improvement Fund again, and that is shared with CUPE. And we'll have, through consultation, we'll determine how those funds will support education assistance in classrooms. We have the Community Link Fund, which is up just slightly. I think it was $645 this year, so we're not looking at it really moving much better than modestly for inflation. That supports school meal programs and some other areas such as behavior supports and community school activities. Our annual facilities grant is exactly the same as it is this year. 1.855 million. So that's what helps us support our building upkeep. And those are all special purpose funds. So this is the end of my budget presentation. So what is next? We're having a public meeting on Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. And we'll go over the budget with the public that attend and ask them for feedback. We'll actually have an advisory committee meeting before that, so we'll also have a chance for the advisory committee members to provide us with additional feedback and information. Staff will continue to work on developing options to reduce the shortfall. There is a shortfall. We haven't provided any options at this point. Well, what can the board be considering to deal with that? That's a really important next step to bring to the board, is to show you, here's how we think that can be managed, and now and have options, and so that you can consider different, I use the word options again, different options for how we'll address that. We need to make sure that we are ready by the end of April for the staffing process. So we need to know how many teachers and how many staff members we're going to have in the budget at that time, because that process needs to start in May. The board is going to give first and second reading to the budget, plan to give first and second reading of the budget at the June 4th, 2019 meeting. That's assuming that we have confirmation on the Classroom Enhancement Fund dollars. If they're going to be different, they'll be asking us to project those dollars. And although they've given us a preliminary estimate, they want our budget to align with what they've announced. And then we're going to do third and final readings sometime in June, likely. So there is still opportunity once our staffing is all set, if surplus is coming in higher in May, to make some other types of adjustments. We will still have some room, but we need to be pretty solid that we have a budget that balances at the end of April, and it kind of sits open for a month, and things can happen in that month. We'll get a May enrollment count that might change the forecasted revenues. We should have secured by that time our employer health tax reimbursement. We should have by that time received our February count funding, which isn't in yet. So there might be a few factors, but we need to make sure that we are targeting to have a balanced budget, but it could be potentially still altered for some minor priorities that the board might have after that. And so that's basically the starting point of the things that would be considered for the budget.
Thank you, Trustee Thorne.
My only concern, thank you, it's great. Coates and Spanim is talking about this summer adding on 3 more grades in their school, so that's going to have a big impact to go from grade 4 to I think grade 7. So that might change our numbers for September.
So with those three,
Yes.
with those 3 grades, are they then? They're not students that are just staying from the year. They're actually going to be recruiting out for the other 3 grades to fill them.
Yes.
That could be an impact. Yeah.
Further questions of the Secretary Treasurer? Board? I have a minor one. The district staff is going to look at some possible options to reduce the shortfall. Is that something that's reducing in the areas of enhancement already? Like it's not our classrooms or anything that's contractual, that's
Right.
all in place,
Yeah,
so.
can't be contractual.
Right, so we have a small amount of money then that is being looked at to reduce those areas in order to put some of these new areas into the budget.
It's a challenge.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing your recommendations on reductions if we want to do some additions.
That's right.
Okay. On the other hand, we may not.
We still need to do reductions just to balance.
So then the question becomes, why are we looking at all these new additions if we're moving into reductions?
Some of those may be a priority and may warrant something else shifting.
Okay, so we have a delicate balance this year. Trustees?
Yes.
I think we're just right. Okay, no other questions? Anything from Secretary Treasurer?
I have nothing further.
Okay, then I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Trustee DeGroot and Trustee Doman, all those in favor? Motion carries without Trustee Doman. Thank you.